Hello, knowledge seekers. Scott Hershovitz is director of the Law and Ethics program and professor of law and philosophy at the University of Michigan. Previously, he served as a law clerk for Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg of the U.S. Supreme Court. He's also the author of the new book titled Nasty, Brutish, and Short: Adventures in Philosophy with My Kids. Scott, thank you for the time. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Thanks so much for having me. Thrilled to be here.
It's my pleasure, Scott. So to start off, for a little bit of context, what is philosophy?
Oh, that is a really phenomenal question. In fact, the book starts with my accidentally ending up as a philosopher. I wanted to take a psychology class, and it was full, and an intro philosophy fulfilled a requirement. And by the second day, I was hooked. And then I went home and I told my parents, I think I'm going to major in philosophy. My dad's question was, what's philosophy? And I had no idea how to answer. And that was kind of my persistent state for years, until my older son, Rex, was in second grade, and he went to school on the first day, and they asked the kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? And he said he wanted to be a philosopher of math. And so when he got home, I said, well, your teacher says you want to be a philosopher of math. What's philosophy? And he said, it's the art of thinking. Which is, I think, as good a description as I've ever heard. So I think philosophers are people that find puzzling things about the world and they think about them carefully.
Yeah, search for knowledge. I think that's a very good description of it. Why are kids so uniquely adept as philosophers?
So I think it's a few things. The first is they're new to the world and they're persistently puzzled by it. They don't yet have the explanations for everything that's happening around them, and they're trying to make sense of it. So they very frequently question the things that grownups take for granted. I think that's a big part of the reason that kids are phenomenal philosophers. A second part of it is that, at least especially the little kids, they're not afraid of seeming silly. So, an adult might not be willing to venture an answer for something that they find puzzling, because or even to articulate the question that they find puzzling, because they're worried that other people will judge them for not knowing the answer or for having such an oddball question. But kids just don't have that worry. So, they're willing to ask questions like, am I dreaming my entire life? Or my 7-year-old once gave me an argument about how big the universe is. He thought that, like, in his mind he had figured it out, and most adults, I think, even if they had the set of thoughts he had, wouldn't share them with other people until they'd done some Googling first.
This book is broken up into 3 different parts. Part 1 is making sense of morality. That leads us to chapter 1, rights. When I think about the conversations that I have with my kids about rights, Scott, it usually involves the words "not fair" coming out of their mouths. And I'm going to be honest with you. Those are trigger words for me. I do not like hearing those words coming out of their mouths. You write that rights are relationships. How so?
So I think that let's just take like a simple example to think about, like, what rights are. Suppose that I borrowed money from you, and now it's come due. So I owe you $1,000 today. What does it mean for me to owe you $1,000 today? It means you can claim it from me. You can say, hey, Scott, today's the day. Give me the $1,000. It means that, other things being equal, I ought to pay you the $1,000. Now, the other things being equal is an important qualification, because maybe there's some kind of emergency. I need to pay for my kid's medical care or something. So all things considered, I not pay you the $1,000. But generally, when you make the claim, I should deliver what I said I would. If I discover I'm going to have some problem, I should tell you in advance. If I can't pay, I've got to make it up to you. And so I think rights are a kind of relationship that we often stand in respect of various things that we might owe each other. I just want to say something about, like, the kids and fairness. I am 100% with you, because it's a kind of all-purpose moral word for little kids. So they've learned to compare themselves to others and to think about fairness in this comparative way. I'm not getting what he got. And so they complain that's not fair, but they often don't see the differences in situation. We go through this with our younger one a lot, who doesn't understand why maybe his older brother gets some privileges that he doesn't yet. But I share your frustration at the frequency with which that's the wrong alleged.
Well, I think at the foundation of it all, it's an understanding, and perhaps it's me being an adult, is that life is not fair. And it could be your sibling, it could be your friends, it could be a relative or somebody completely different. Like, you're going to have it better than some people, and you're going to have it worse off than some people. And it's all about what you do with those situations. But that's part of the process right now with the 7 and 5-year-old anyhow, is convincing them that even though something's not fair, it's okay to recognize it. That doesn't mean it's a good time to throw a fit about it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that there's a conversation about fairness, like maybe towards the very end of the book, in the conclusion, where I'm thinking about how to raise a philosopher. And one of the things I suggest that you do there is, when your kid makes these, when your kid complains that something's not fair, start asking them questions. Explain what fairness is. And then I think one of the most important questions is, ask whether it's your job to make things fair. I think that's part of what you're getting at. Ask them if they think the answer is yes, as they probably will, how they would do that, right? And sometimes actually they'll offer you a kind of creative solution. Maybe it'll be something you can do in the moment, or maybe it'll be that, well, it's this time it's benefiting the 7-year-old, and next time something could benefit the 5-year-old. But I think like there's an opportunity when kids make these complaints to engage them in a conversation about fairness, and to lead them to your thought that not everything's going to end up exactly equal on all occasions.
Completely agreed with asking them what fairness is. I've definitely gone down that road before. I have not asked them to explain what they think would be in this situation. So thank you for that advice. I'll make sure to apply that going forward. Chapter 2 is revenge. I give my kids a choice when one has screwed over the other. My consequences, or a bit of eye for eye treatment, where they get to decide what the punishment is. Why do they always choose to be the one to carry out the punishment, Scott?
Oh, I think that we may be hardwired to take some satisfaction in visiting unpleasantness on the people who have wronged us. I think there's something self-protective often about taking revenge. At the very least, you communicate to the person who's wronged you and other people that might wrong you that you're not going to stand for that sort of treatment. It'll get them to think twice about treating you that way again. But I'm actually really curious now. When you give them the choice of meting out the punishment, is it harsher than what you would have done? Is it, are they kinder to each other? What happens?
Usually it involves something physical. So it's like brother hits sister on the arm, so his sister gets to hit him back on the arm, or it has something to do with a toy being stolen or destroyed. And then I say, look, you want to take one of his toys now, or one of her toys now, and do what was done to that, so that they kind of learn the disrespect for property. And I usually try and keep it pretty even. So like if one of them hits the other one in the arm, I don't let the other one sock them in the nose necessarily. But
Right.
the funny thing about it is, usually the attempt to exact the same sort of revenge never goes that well, because the other one has a chance to brace for it. So inevitably they're not as physically or emotionally hurt by whatever the response was.
Oh, it's really fascinating. I have a colleague who teaches here at Michigan named Bill Miller, who's one of the world's leading experts on revenge and honor cultures. And actually, like, historically, there's a lot of interest in just the problem that you're describing, that it's really hard to get things to match exactly, maybe impossible, in part because circumstances are different. So if we do an eye for an eye, there may be reasons that your eye is more valuable to you than my eye is. That's a really fascinating parenting strategy. I don't know that I've heard other people describe the invitation to issue an eye for an eye. Do they ever pick you? Do you ever say, like, I'm going to let dad do it?
Usually not. No, I mean, sometimes I take the I take the horse by the reins, so to speak, and just go ahead and dole out the punishment when necessary. But usually if I give that option, they almost always choose to be the one to carry it out. And it's funny because oftentimes it'll end with all of us laughing about the ridiculousness of the situation. So
Oh,
it's one
wow.
thing if they're like lying at school or something, or they lie to mom or dad about something. Like, obviously that's going to be upsetting, and that's a completely different set of consequences that we're dealing with. But when it's something seemingly trivial between the two of them, letting them try and hash it out with one another, I think
Right.
in my mind is healthy, because mom, dad, adults aren't always going to be around, and you have to understand how to how to maybe respond if somebody or something has screwed you over.
Well, I think it's great that it often ends up in laughter. That suggests that you're accomplishing something, helping them sort of restore their positive relationship. And I completely agree with what you said at the end. I think like one of the real challenges parenting when you have multiple kids is sometimes just staying in the other room and staying out of it and letting them find their way to an agreement, because you're not always going to be there.
Well, the other thing, or one of the things that I have a really difficult time with, Scott, is because my kids are very bright and I have high expectations for them, is keeping my mouth shut and not always offering up unsolicited advice. And that's not necessarily something in this book, but is that something that you struggle with at all? Because it seems like you have a couple of bright young philosophers in your household of not overstepping that line where you're trying to insist or suggest too many things versus just being supportive of whatever it is that they're doing.
I struggle with that a lot, and I think I'm not always great at it, because it's hard when you see somebody that you care about that you think is making a mistake, or just hasn't yet found the solution to their problem. I mean, one thing that is in the book and that I try to use in these situations is kind of the Socratic method that I use when I teach my law students. So maybe I'll ask some questions here in the hopes that the questions will lead the kid to the right set of thoughts. But I'd be lying if I said I was always successful at holding back the advice.
That's fair. Chapter 3 is punishment. What do exotic animal trainers have to do with punishment or the lack thereof?
Yeah, so the chapter starts with, or maybe not starts, but in the chapter I talk about this article that was in the New York Times maybe 10 years ago. That was one of the most shared, or may have been the most emailed article ever from the New York Times website. It was about Amy Sutherland was the author, and she was writing a book about training exotic animals, and visiting like SeaWorld and watching how they would train a seal to balance a ball on his nose. And then she realized, oh, wait a minute, these things I'm learning at SeaWorld, maybe I can use them on my husband, and train him to put his clothes in the laundry hamper, and put his car keys where they belong, so he's not constantly losing them. And so she reports that it worked. She would do things like, instead of nagging him about his clothes, she would ignore them if they were on the floor. And then if he put even like a little bit like one piece of clothing in the hamper, she'd praise him wildly in the way that you would praise an animal that you were trying to train and adjust their behavior. And I say in the chapter, like, when you think about spousal relationships, I'm amused by this, but I think it worrisome to relate to your spouse in this way, where you've seen them as a kind of project, or something that you're entitled to manipulate and control. But I actually think that it's really important to think of very, very young children that way, that they're not yet responsible for what they do. When they're 2, 3, 4, they don't really have the capability to reason about things and see that other people are appropriately making demands on them, and to adjust their behavior in response to those demands. And so I think for the littlest kids, figuring out how you change their environment, how you adjust their incentives to get them behaving well and to create the habits of behaving well, I think is the right kind of approach. And then I think it's important to find a way to transition, right, from that stage of parenting to a stage of parenting where you treat your child like a person, and you treat them like they're responsible for what they're doing. I think it's important to help them become responsible for what they're doing.
And you said that transition normally happens around 5 to 7. And the key to effective punishment is making sure that they understand whatever it was that they did wrong in that circumstance.
Yeah, so I think that at least in my experience, somewhere around 5 to 7 is when it felt like actually these punishments are real, and that I mean them to communicate condemnation, right? When my kid was when our kids were 2 or 3, and having trouble sharing and taking things from another kid, you might take it back, give it to the other kid, you might put them in a timeout for a few minutes. But I was never mad at the kid, right? Because they didn't yet have the capability to control their behavior. It was my job to help them develop those skills. Somewhere, as you say, like 5, 7, could be later with respect to some things, I think you do start to have what philosophers call reactive attitudes. You start to feel angry or resentful or indignant maybe about the way one kid has treated another, or has treated someone else. And I do think it's important to communicate that. As I say, like, I think anger is often the wrong emotion, because you're warranted in being angry when someone slighted you, right? But if one kid has slighted another kid, I think you want to communicate that you're disappointed. Send the message that we expect better out of you, but you absolutely have to tell them why, so that you introduce them to those reasons and get them thinking about them, so they can account for them in the future.
You wrote that punishment should hold open the possibility that we can do it harmoniously. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think live together harmoniously at the end. So I talk about a situation where my younger son Hank was insolent at bedtime, both in his refusal to go to bed and the way he was talking to his mother. And so we sent him to bed with the consequence that he wasn't going to be allowed to play Minecraft the next day. And Minecraft is maybe the thing he loves most in the world. So this was a significant thing for him. And you could hear him sort of crying in his bed. And I thought it important not to leave him distraught in that way. So I went into his room and we talked a little bit about what he's done. But I also wanted him, like, I made silly jokes until he smiled. I wanted him to go to bed feeling like we loved him, that he's a member of this family, that he always will be, notwithstanding the fact that you did something bad. And then I really would like people to take away a kind of similar message for how we think about punishing adults in our society. That in almost every case, the people we punish are going to become part of our communities again. But I don't think I think too often we don't treat them that way. We don't treat them with a kind of basic dignity and respect. And I think that it's bad for them, and I think ultimately it turns out to be bad for us too, because if you don't treat people with dignity and respect, you shouldn't expect to get that treatment in return when they rejoin the community.
Chapter 4 is authority. Because I said so is very lazy parenting, but it's also understandable at times when you are just tired of trying to get through to them as to why something is going down. Why is it important to try and avoid because I said so whenever possible, Scott?
So I want my kids to be able to make decisions for themselves someday. So I think they need to understand why I'm making the decisions that I am, when, as you say, like when there's time to explain, or when I think it might be something that the child could understand, right? So with with a 2-year-old or 3-year-old, there may be reasons you're making decisions that aren't going to make sense to them yet. So maybe you give them a very basic version and save the more detailed explanation until they're older. But certainly at the stage my kids are at, sometimes I need to say, this is how we're going to do things. But a 12-year-old can probably understand my reasoning. So if I don't have time to explain it now, then I should explain it later. Hey, let me tell you why I made that decision that I did, and be open to having a conversation about it. So I think that the chapter is sort of struggling with the question: can because I said so ever be a reason for one person to do what another person is telling them to do? And I think in some circumstances it can be, right? If we're in an emergency and like the plane is going down and the flight attendant is telling us how we're going to get off the plane to maximize everyone else's chances of getting off, I think it would be a crazy thing to do for people on the plane to start debating whether she's got this right and maybe we should do it a different way. We're just going to end up in chaos. We should do what she says. She's been trained for this moment. So I do think because I said so can be in some circumstances a compelling reason. But if you want your kid to be responsible for themselves someday, you also have to share why you said so.
Agreed. You write that even in the most asymmetrical relationships, power is rarely one-sided. How so?
Oh, I mean, just think about the way your children manipulate and control your behavior. So, the chapter on authority begins with Rex's refusal to wear shoes when we're leaving the house, which, fortunately, we're now way past the stage where the protest was, I'm not putting on my shoes. But we spent years in battle over, will you put on your shoes? Not will you put up, I say put on your shoes and he says no shoes. And some days we left the house with shoes on his feet, and some days we left the house with shoes on the floor of the car in the hopes that I'd get them on later or his teachers would get them on, because you have kids, you know what they do. They throw a tantrum, they cry, you're worried you're going to be late for work. power is even in situations I say that are hierarchical, parent and child, boss and employee, right? Employees can slow work down, employees can walk out. Power is often sort of shared and negotiated.
Yeah, the big one in our house is jackets. For whatever reason, even when it's freezing outside, our kids don't want to put their jackets on to go to school. They know that they're going to need the jackets to play outside, but it's just
Right.
this tooth pulling process.
Where do you live?
I live in Austin, Texas, so it doesn't
Okay.
get crazy cold here like up in Chicago or something, but
Yeah.
it'll still get chilly in the winter, especially for kids that are used to wearing shorts and t-shirts year round. I mean, when it's in the
Yeah.
40s or 30s outside, you need to put your jacket on. For my
Yeah.
son especially, it's a version of the shoe thing too, where he always wants to wear slides or flip-flops, and it's like, dude, you got to wear shoes to school. I'm sorry.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm raising Michigan kids, and I do think like when they've grown up in the cold, they're a little bit of a different breed. But but yeah, I do think like my adolescent at the beginning of this winter, we thought his main goal in life was never to have any of his friends see him wearing a jacket. um, and eventually we knew that real winter had arrived when he caved.
That's funny. All right, chapter 5 is language. Scott, why are some words bad?
So I think it's a really interesting question. It's a question I've been thinking about since I was a kid. It's just puzzling that, here's a word and everyone agrees that you can't say it, but there's other words that mean the same thing, and it's fine to say those words. And, I found an explanation that I found compelling from a philosopher of language named Rebecca Roach, who describes a process she calls offense escalation. She says, look, it's hard to know why it gets started with particular words, but if a word becomes disfavored, then when you say that word around other people, they're going to be offended by it. And then once people know that people are going to be offended by that word, the process repeats. Wow, you said this word that you know that I'm going to find offensive. Now I'm really offended that you've said this word. And she says, like the words that have this, that undergo this process, they tend to have some things in common. They tend to be related to taboo topics like sex or defecation or disease, blasphemy, maybe. A lot of them are also kind of short, harsh sounding words. She says at one point, like whiffy and slush are not going to be swear words because you can't use them to convey that you're angry or upset or frustrated. It's like the short, like staccato words that work well for that. But I think it's entirely conventional that that some words rather than others. I'm talking delicately because I don't know what we're allowed to say on your podcast. Whether I can give examples.
You can say fuck, you can say whatever you want to, Scott.
Oh,
If you want to say the N-word, I'm probably going to bleep you, but I don't think you're going to say the N-word.
I definitely don't want to say the N-word, as you can tell from the end of the chapter. But yeah, so it's really unclear why it's shit and not crap or poop. But surely there's a story for a historian to tell somewhere as to how that came to be the word that underwent this process of offense escalation.
Well, then there's a word like bullshit that I understand the word shit is in there, but it's such an effective and important word in our language. Like that word should just be flat out allowed, even if we're talking about 10 in the morning on network television.
Yeah, there's there's a discussion in the chapter of a book by a philosopher named Harry Frankfurt, which became kind of popular maybe 15 or 20 years ago, called On Bullshit. Where it was an attempt to figure out just what bullshit is. And it's a small volume. It's fun. His idea of what bullshit is that it's when you're bullshitting when you're talking without caring whether what you say is true. So it's different than lying, right? It's not that you believe that what you're saying is false. Maybe sometimes you do, but you just don't really care. You're just you're making up a story. You're bullshitting your way through it. One thing I think is interesting is I think that's a kind of bullshit, but I don't think it's the only kind of bullshit, right? So and I don't know that I have a better theory of bullshit yet, but like it makes perfect sense to say, oh, like flopping in soccer is bullshit, and I think it is. But it's unclear how that kind of bullshit relates to the kind of thing we do when we're bullshitting.
An earlier conversation on this podcast with John V. Petruccelli, who wrote a book called The Life-Changing Science of Detecting Bullshit. And he breaks down the different types of bullshit, how to call somebody out on bullshit, how to detect it, obviously, as the title would suggest. Highly recommend folks go back and check out that episode. But as far as language is concerned, Scott, I need to share a little story with you regarding my 7-year-old. When she was almost 3, It was July 4th. I remember this very clearly. Here in Texas, obviously in July, it is quite hot and sunny outside. We were loading up into the car to go to a July 4th party. And it was me and her first. And she had gotten to the point where she knew how to kind of buckle herself in. And as we were waiting for mom and brother to get outside, she said, "Daddy, can you please give me my sunglasses?" And I said, "Absolutely, honey. Why do you need your sunglasses right now?" And she said, "Because of the fucking sun." And
Yeah.
I looked back at her, kind of chuckled, and I'm like, "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" She said, "Can I please have my sunglasses?" with this cute little 3-year-old smile on her face. I said, "No, after that." She said, "Oh, because of the fucking sun." And I had to give it to her, Scott, because she had perfect context on that seemingly serious cuss word. And that brings me to my question of how much context actually matters when we're talking about most bad words.
Oh, a ton. I mean, I want to say something about the story, which I love. Um, and for anybody out there who's thinking, oh, like Trey must be a bad parent. This is just completely typical that children, say between 3 and 7, master most swear words, including the most extreme swear words. So it's not at all. It's just a reflection of the fact that they exist in the world. It's not at all a reflection of deficient parenting. And it sounds like you're parenting well, because she used it so perfectly. So I think that context matters a ton, and that's one thing I've wanted to convey to children, which is that it's not that these words are completely off limits. I think that's the wrong way to go about parenting. It's that there's a time and a place and a way in which you may say them. So in our house, you may not say them in ways that are mean or demeaning of other people. That's off limits. You need to understand that you can't say them at school, you can't say them at synagogue, but if you're hanging out with your friends playing a video game and something bad happens, that's the context in which you can use the word, or you're telling a story and it's funny. So I think that there's a lot of research about swear words, and a lot of research about the productive role that they play in a lot of social relationships, that they help people make connections and get along in difficult circumstances. And I want my kids to grow up into adults that can say, "I need my sunglasses because of the fucking sun," in the right context, and have people be appreciative.
Yeah, I think the other important thing with teaching kids about the value of understanding when certain words are allowed and when they're not is you gain a greater understanding and respect for language on the whole. And I think it teaches you also to become a critical thinker. So much to what you just said, we talk with our kids about language all the time. And yeah, my son probably said "fuck" the other day when we were playing Super Smash Brothers and he got killed by the computer. But we tell them, look, there may be a time and place for just about every word. There are some words, racial slurs, for instance, that you should probably avoid at all costs. But even then, words like racial slurs, if they appear in a movie and it's being done so for effects, like that's why that word shouldn't be flat out illegal necessarily. But if you're trying to say certain words that you can say around mom or dad, like you said, at school, at church, around your grandmothers, you will pretty immediately get in trouble for that, because unfortunately the context there doesn't just have to do with what you're saying. It has to do with the audience as well.
Yeah. And so I agree with you. And we've got the same lines in our house. I think slurs are different than swear words because they're always demeaning, right? So if you're starting from the view that, hey, we're not going to use words in a way that that tear other people down, that are demeaning, then you're going to put slurs in a different category than swear words.
That's very well said there. Part 2 of this book is making sense of ourselves. That leads us to chapter 6, sex, gender, and sports. Sports, especially around the time that humans reach puberty, becomes very sexually segregated. Why?
So the chapter starts with this story. The first time my older son Rex ran a 5K, he was in 2nd grade, and he did great. We were excited to see him run, and celebrating at the finish line. And I said to him, hey, did you see what your friend, in the book I call her Susie because I've changed the names of the kids that aren't mine. See what your friend Susie did. She finished, I think, a good 7 minutes before Rex. She comes from a family of runners. She was the first girl to finish, and she was also just the first to finish among 2nd graders, period. Beat all the girls, beat all the boys. But one of those boys got a first place medal nonetheless, because even at that age, the local elementary school was segregating this race. Boys and girls were running at the same time, but not against each other. And so that's an occasion to ask the question, hey, look, what are we up to here? Why do we have one race for boys and one race for girls? I say in the chapter that I'm not sure that we should for the youngest kids. Because as this story illustrates, in second grade, there really isn't any differentiation by sex, and I think actually might be good for the boys to run against the girls and know that the girls are competitive and may beat them. As you say, as you suggest, that approach has a kind of short shelf life, because there'll be some point in the development of these kids where though many girls will still continue to beat many boys, at the very tail end of performance, we would expect the fastest boys to outrun the fastest girls. And so I actually really loved doing the research for this chapter, because I learned about there's a field called philosophy of sport, and there's some really terrific feminist writers who think about sports. And one in particular whose work I found really persuasive was this philosopher named Jane English. And she was a really talented amateur athlete herself. And she says, look, let's just think about why we engage in sports. She says there's two main reasons. There's what she calls the basic goods of sports. Those are things like we participate for health and for fun and for self-respect, the chance to develop our skills. And she says, look, sports should be available to absolutely everybody for those reasons, right? Everybody should be able to sign up to run in the race or to play in a soccer league. She says there's another kind of benefit that sports have, what she calls the scarce benefits of sports. Those are things like the chance to win the race, or to, play in the professional league and get fame and fortune. And she says, just in the nature of those things, that they're not going to be accessible to everyone. Not everybody can win the race, or not everyone can play a sport at its highest level. And when she's thinking about sex equality in the context of sport, she says, look, for the basic sports, as she said, everyone needs the chance to participate. But for the scarce goods, she thought, it's important that women be able to claim an equal share of them. Right. So no individual woman can say, hey, I should get a chance to win the race, or I should get a chance to play in a professional league. But our society accords lots of influence and power to people who excel in sports. And if we didn't have women's sports, those opportunities to achieve that fame, that fortune, that influence over our society would only be available to men. And so that's the kind of argument for having a WNBA and a women's national soccer team, and on and on. And I find that argument really compelling.
Well, and just speaking about the biological importance of competition and same-sex competition, I spoke with Frans de Waal recently, who is a renowned primatologist, about his new book, Gender, that really does a great job of breaking down a bunch of stereotypes that we have about the genders through the eyes of a primatologist. So he's spent much of his professional life studying chimps and bonobos, which of course are the animals that are closest to us genetically. And he says in those worlds, at younger ages and at older ages, you oftentimes see the males and females breaking up into their specific sex and competing with one another or playing with one another. And so it's not unnatural, although the conversation has obviously shifted over the last couple of years with transgender athletes, to want to play against those that you identify with the most.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed that interview. It was terrific, and I recommend people listen to it. I just gave you an argument for having sports that are segregated, men's sports and women's sports, at least among adults. And once you decide you're going to have that practice, it raises this kind of practical question of who's going to count as a woman for purposes of women's sports. And I started when I started thinking about this in part because my son asked. We were watching the women's soccer team, and he asked whether a trans woman could play women's sports. And at the time, I'm not even sure that we knew what the rule was. So that got me thinking about it and reading, as I said, lots of feminist philosophy, lots of trans philosophers, and I didn't know where I'd come out, what I would think was the right answer when I finished. But as I learned more about it and thought about it, I came to think that as I think is true in lots of areas of life, or all areas of life, that if somebody identifies as a woman, sees themselves as a woman, that we should respect that and treat them as a woman. And I think that extends even to sports. And I think there's a kind of mistake people are making when they say, hey, no, wait a minute, like we had biological reasons for having men's and women's sports to begin with, and so we have to track biology in the way that we determine eligibility for sports. I think that actually the science here is more muddled than you might guess. So a lot of people are just assuming that trans women will have an advantage because of the course of their biological development, and the science as to whether there is an advantage, especially once somebody has taken hormone therapy, is really equivocal, and I think there's much less evidence across a lot of contexts that there's a kind of built-in advantage that you might suspect is evidenced by the fact that there are trans women participating in many sports, and cis women are holding their own in competition quite frequently. So that's a kind of like factual issue. But the more important thing, I think, is we need to remember that all athletes are biologically different from one another. And you watch Usain Bolt in a race or Michael Phelps in a race, and you know that they've got biological advantages over their competitors. Phelps had a body with very odd proportions, an extraordinary wingspan, and very large hands and very large feet that allowed him to become the greatest swimmer of all time. And and I think so that's the first thing to say, is there's always biological differences among competitors. And then I just want to go back to what we learned from Jane English. Remember, what she taught us is that nobody has an individual right to the scarce benefits of sports, right? That nobody has a right to be the person who wins the race. And in fact, she would tell us nobody even has a right to a level playing field. If you were in the starting blocks about to race Michael Phelps, you probably wouldn't be thinking, I've got a chance to win this race, right? You'd be thinking, well, that guy was blessed by advantages that I don't have. Maybe I'll get lucky. Maybe he won't have his best day, but this is not a competition that I've got a good shot to win. But nobody ever said, hey, let's get Phelps out of the pool, or let's get Bolt off the track and give these other guys a chance to win. So I think that in general, we ought to respect people's self-understanding, and sports just strikes me as another place where that's true.
Generally speaking, I agree with you. And I want to preface what I'm about to say the way that I preface it with Frans de Waal, and that is trans people deserve our love and support as much as anybody else. Having said that, though, when you're talking about somebody who has gone through puberty, and there are actual advantages that come with that if you are a biological male versus a biological female, with bone density, general strength, the strength of tendons, tissues, muscles, things like that. And then you talk about somebody making it all the way through puberty without having to take what are essentially performance enhancing drugs to quote unquote level the playing field with biological females. That's where I think there's a little bit of an issue. And while I am amongst those who is trying to figure out a proper solution right now, I don't know if allowing somebody in true competition, and obviously the best example that we have right now, Scott, is Leah Thomas, who was just swimming as a women's swimmer after spending a year at Penn as a men's swimmer. And even though her times did go down in the various events that she was competing in, she was still defeating women and setting records at a number of events. I think that there's a clear distinction there versus somebody who is starting that process pre-puberty, which gets into a very muddled conversation, obviously, with regards to what is acceptable, what's not acceptable, with regards to letting somebody make lifelong decisions that will have an impact for the rest of that person's life. But as far as somebody who has gone through puberty already, who wants to compete at the college level, at the Olympic level, at the professional level as a woman, once they've already gone through puberty as a man, I just have a hard time accepting that, because it just seems like you're screwing a lot of biological females in the process.
Yeah, so I think it's just that last little bit that I want to push back on,
Okay.
right? The thought that somebody here is intrude. So a philosopher who's really influenced the way that I think about this, her name is Veronica Ivy, and she's a trans athlete, and she wrote an article once about the women's high jump competition in the Olympics. The person who won was 8 inches taller than the person who lost. And, surely that provided a kind of biomechanical advantage that let this person jump higher than some of her competitors. But nobody said, oh, hey, look, this is an unfair competition because you've got this different biology than me. So that, means that it's not fair for me to compete against you. I think that the kind of sex differences that you're talking about, they're just further different kinds of further differences in biology. And might they sometimes provide advantages? Sure, but they're just like one among of many of biological differences that people might have that could provide an advantage. And I'm not sure we have a good reason for singling those out and saying, let's treat these biological differences differently than we think of natural height differences or natural strength differences. But there was one thing that de Waal said in the interview that I thought was actually also important, because he said that sports is just one small part of a bigger question, really a bigger problem in our society of how are we going to treat people with respect, how are we going to welcome them into our community, and it's maybe, for the reasons you're describing, the most difficult, challenging, fraught place in which to have this conversation. So if we had basic agreement everywhere else in life that we were going to treat trans people with respect, then I might find it easier to engage the question about what we should do in sports. But I do worry that we've kind of allowed, as de Waal said, a kind of a question about a very small handful of athletes to loom very large in the way we think about a much more pressing social problem.
That's fair. Let me ask this question before we move on. With regards to transgender athletes, there are folks out there who identify as a race other than their own. An example from the past 10 years is Rachel Dolezal, who was a white woman, but she identified as African American. Should somebody like that be allowed access to something like scholarships intended for African Americans?
So there's a really interesting question. It's an active topic of conversation among philosophers. So, like, what's the relationship, or what are the similarities and differences between being transgender and being what some people want to call transracial? And there was a really interesting article by a philosopher named Robin Dembroff that I found very helpful in thinking about this issue, that suggested that race and gender function really differently in our society. That gender is, well, I'll usually start with race, actually. That the way race functions in our society is a kind of, it transmits a kind of historical disadvantage, right? If you're Black in America today, very frequently your parents were subject to discrimination, which has affected your life opportunities, and then their parents were subject to probably even a set of harsher discrimination, and go back far enough, and maybe you arrive at a place where people were enslaved. And so there's a kind of, through the status of race in our society, historical advantages and disadvantages are handed down from generation to generation. So to decide at one moment, oh, I'm switching, Dolezal can say, if she wants to, that she's Black, but that doesn't mean that she's situated in the world the way a Black person would be, as having had parents who'd say didn't get to go to college or didn't get to own property because of their race. So gender works really differently in our society. It's also a way in which people are discriminated against and disadvantaged, but it doesn't tend to pass down from generation to generation in the same way. If you're a woman now, you are at risk of being catcalled in the street and paid less for the same work than a man would be. And so it doesn't have this kind of historical transmission of disadvantage. The disadvantage is a kind of present state. And Dembroff says this is a reason to think about these, to think about transgender identification and transracial identification differently. I think the reason it's off-putting when Dolezal says, hey, I see myself as Black, give me, benefits saying college admissions or scholarships, as you like, in other ways, to say, well, wait a minute, like, you're not, like, your family weren't subject to the historical injustices that those programs are attempting to remedy.
But at the same time, she has a stronger argument as being African-American than somebody who was born a biological male claiming to be female, because if you go back far enough, we're all African, Scott.
Yeah, so I think you want to be careful about what we mean when we say something like that, which is to say all human beings all human beings are descended from populations that lived in Africa. That's true. But that's not really what we mean when we say that somebody's African-American in the United States today. What we're doing is we're describing a position in a kind of social hierarchy created by slavery, where people who had come to this part of the world from Europe forcibly brought people who were then in Africa here and created these kinds of new identities, right? Like that's when you get the idea that some people are white and some people are Black. And it was a way of creating a kind of social hierarchy so that some people could be treated as less than human, as appropriately enslaved.
Yeah, boy, that's a fascinating answer there. I feel like there's it's not absolute though, and there are those families who have been able to fight through the grave injustices from the past 100+ years to actually create better lives for themselves and their families going forward. And there are plenty of examples that you can point to in the past where the oppression of women has been passed on from generation to generation, and so it does feel like it is sliding that sex just a little bit to all of a sudden just say, because somebody feels like they should now be identified as a female versus the biological male that they were born as, that we just need to accept them as that, because that I think that does maybe put down the suffering, the pain, and the fights a lot of women over the years have had to go through in order to gain the level of respect that now exists in 2022.
So I think that a lot of trans women would say, look, when you become a trans woman, you're opting in, right, to that sort of treatment.
So is Rachel Dolezal though.
Well, to a component of it, and I think this is where the difference in these stories lie. So she may be, as I said, like seen now, or may have been seen as Black and disadvantaged or discriminated against in the present because of that, but her family had not experienced the kind of I think people often underestimate just how much of the present day differences that we see in wealth and education trace to our history of not allowing people access to college, of not allowing people access to property ownership, of redlining so that people couldn't take out loans. That is the source of a lot of our historical disadvantage, and Dolezal's family wasn't subject to that kind of disadvantage.
But a lot of things apply to women as well. Anyhow, this is a fascinating conversation. We're probably starting to go in circles here. I appreciate you humoring me. I figured that we could do this because you are a philosopher. You're somebody who loves to share ideas. So thank you for that back and forth. And that leads us to chapter 7, which is race and responsibility. You talk in this chapter about the responsibility of white people to take responsibility for the racist sins of our past and whether or not that is something that is acceptable. The idea of taking responsibility for something that you aren't actually responsible for strikes me as odd. It's kind of like apologizing when you have nothing to be sorry for. But is there a good reason to take responsibility like this? And if so, what is it?
So actually, let's just think about like apologizing for something that you're not responsible for, because I think there's One thing that philosophers in my corner of the world, people who think about moral philosophy, legal philosophy, are interested in is the many different ways in which we can be responsible for something. So I can be responsible in the sense that I'm to blame for something. And if I'm to blame for it, I should be apologizing for it. I can also be responsible even when I'm not to blame. It might just be my responsibility to fix the mess, right? So you see this in the different kinds of legal consequences that that you get, which is to say, like, I can be prosecuted for something I've done through the criminal law and condemned for it and sent to prison for it. But there's another kind of responsibility. I manufacture a product. There's a famous case in products liability law from the 1940s. Coke makes a Coca-Cola bottle explodes in a waitress's hand, and nobody says, "Oh, look, Coca-Cola, you're bad for making a bottle that exploded." Nobody says, "Hey, we got to put some people from Coca-Cola in jail because the bottle exploded and really severely injured this woman's hand." But we do say, as a matter of law, "Hey, Coke, her injuries are your responsibility." Right? You make millions, billions of these bottles. Some of them are going to explode, and it makes sense not to just like leave people that happen to be holding the bad bottle, like coping with those injuries. If we make Coke fix these injuries, then everyone has some assurance. Hey, I can go buy Coke, and I know that I'm going to be taken care of if I happen to be holding the bottle that had a defect in it. So that's a different kind of responsibility. Hey, this mess is yours. Even if you're not morally to blame for having created the mess. We don't think you're bad, Coke, for selling billions of bottles. So I think, actually, like, just think about parenting again for a moment. I think parents are constantly taking responsibility for things that aren't their fault. My kid breaks something of yours, I'm going to fix it, even if I don't think that that like it was my bad parenting that led them to break it. It's just like, I don't want my kids to be your problem. So if my kid came over to your house and he knocked that vase off the table, I'm going to be like, "Hey, could you tell me how much that cost or where you got it? Or can I buy you another one?" I'm going to take responsibility for the mess my kid made. And I think there's something similar about, I think white people in the United States should have a similar attitude towards the disadvantage and discrimination that we see around us. That like the view I have is not that every white person is personally to blame or needs to be apologizing for slavery or for Jim Crow or redlining. But I do think, like, we share this world today, and if you're born into the world and white, that comes with some advantages, some privileges that people who are Black don't have. And as I say in the book, if you're sitting atop the social hierarchy, which really ought not exist, then I think it's not unreasonable to take some responsibility for it and try and find a way to lift other people up, even if you think it's not my fault that there are these disparities in the world.
It's so interesting because, much like with gender, race is a sort of social construct, but it seems counterproductive to try and completely ignore somebody's ethnic makeup, which is obviously a part of what goes into a supposed racial makeup. Do you agree with this, that ignoring somebody's ethnic makeup is a fool's errand?
Yeah, a lot of people want to think, "Oh, here's what I have to do. I have to just not see color." And I think if you choose not to see color in our world, you're choosing to ignore our history and the disadvantages that some people still have because of our history. So I think it's important to see it and acknowledge it, and to want to work to change it. It's not an accident that the average Black family in the United States has 15% of the wealth of the average, or the median Black family has 15% of the wealth of the average white family. There's a history to that. And I think we should face up to that history and think, like, well, how can we bring about a world that's more equal and more fair?
And embrace our differences, by the way. So that kind of leads to the idea of reparations. Are reparations a part of the solution to make up for racism in your mind? And if so, what does that look like, Scott?
So I think that that we should be interested. I think people often think about reparations the wrong way. The line in the book is, I say, we should understand this to be a project, not a payment, right? So there may be some role that that money has to play. And you see various institutions, I think, taking some steps that are constructive. So Georgetown University was once on the verge of bankruptcy, I believe, and then they sold slaves that they had owned to sort of stabilize the financial situation of the college. And some historians actually tracked down the descendants of the slaves that had been sold by Georgetown. And Georgetown is taking steps to make amends. It's offering scholarships, and I think maybe even possibly some cash payments. But I think that sort of thing can be constructive. But that's not really how I think about reparations as a kind of cash payment. I think we want to live in a society. We should want to live in a society that lives up to our founding ideals, right? That says in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, and I think we should want to live in a society that treats people equally. And so we should be working together to find ways where people are treated as equal before the law, and we don't see disparities in punishment. People are treated as equally in employment opportunities. I don't know if I would say it in the book, but I think it's sometimes I think like we'll know that we've gotten there when it would be difficult for a visitor who wasn't familiar with our history to look around and figure out which group of people here was the group of people that was treated really poorly at the outset of this country. And right now we're not even close. It'd be easy to figure out. And I think we gotta mend our society.
No doubt about that. While paying individuals may get a bit tricky, I think that the idea of investing in infrastructure in poor communities, getting back to your socioeconomic comment from a few answers ago, I think that is crucial to make sure to try and set up those individuals who live in poor communities with as good a chance as possible to find success in life. I think that is a big deal. All right, we'd happen to fast forward just a little bit because we're running short on time to chapter 12, God. You don't believe in God, Scott, but you're okay pretending. Why?
Yeah, so I struggle. So I say I'm not. I don't feel certain enough to say that God doesn't exist. But so I guess I fall in this category of agnostic, which is to say I'm skeptical. One of the reasons skeptical, it was really well articulated by my older son Rex recently, who says he was having trouble believing because he looks around the world and he sees all the awfulness, whether it's the pandemic or the war, and just thinks, why would God let us suffer that way? So philosophers traditionally call this the problem of evil. And I read a lot in the book about the way religious philosophers try and reconcile the existence of evil in the world with the existence of God. I'm not sure that I'm there. I'm not sure that I see a way to reconcile them. But I say, nevertheless, religious rituals and religious community play an important role in my life. That's something else I learned from my son when he was 4 years old. He asked whether God was real, and I said, "Hey, buddy, what do you think?" And he said, "For real, God is pretend, and for pretend, God is real." And I was just so struck by that because I thought, like, you know, he asked him to tell me what he meant. He said, like, well, when we pretend God is real. And I think there's a lot to be said in life. Like, you notice this when you have little kids. There's a lot to be said for pretending. And I think it can make life more meaningful. And even though I'm not sure I believe in God, I find a lot of value from going to synagogue and participating in the traditions that my family, my people have participated in for generations, and celebrating these holidays, even if it's a kind of pretend, it makes my life more richer and more meaningful.
Very well said there. All right, last thing, Scott. In the conclusion, it may actually be after the conclusion, you write that the most important books that you can buy your kid is the complete Calvin and Hobbes collection by Bill Watterson. I just want you to know that I have a 5-year-old blonde-haired son named Calvin, who is named that in large part because of that comic strip. So I agree with you on that. And I think at a certain age, it's probably worth investing in the Far Side as well.
Yeah, Far Side's great too. Calvin and Hobbes, I think, is the best possible introduction to philosophy. You don't know that you're doing philosophy, but very often Calvin is playing with philosophical ideas, just in a way that's the most fun possible.
No doubt about that. He is Scott Hershovitz, director of the Law and Ethics program and professor of law and philosophy at the University of Michigan. Previously, he served as a law clerk for Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. He's also the author of the new book titled Nasty, Brutish, and Short: Adventures in Philosophy with My Kids. Scott, thank you so much for the time today, and thank you for this wonderful book.
This was a blast. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks to Gentleman Jesus for the intro and outro music. Hear more of his work at gentlemanjesus.com. Thanks to Josh Bates for the video editing. If you have any video editing needs, hit him up on Instagram at Forager Digital. And thanks as always to you for checking us out. You can watch, listen, learn, and connect for free at booksonpod.com. For Books on Pod, I'm Trey Elling. Good day.